My cruel mother-in-law closed the door behind me and threw me out of the house when I was pregnant. She threatened to file for divorce if I didn't give her son, my husband, ownership of my $10 million home when she requested it. Instead of standing with me, my spouse took her side. They pushed me away, threw out everything I owned, and told me to leave when I didn't cooperate. As I left the house I had constructed, I felt abandoned and powerless. I made the decision right then and there that I would not allow them to get away with this. Determined to put things right, I secretly prepared my retaliation. I took them both to court, keeping my plans a secret until the appropriate moment. However, everyone involved was taken aback by the court's judgment. I'm Grace, and I've always thought that the cornerstone of a fulfilling life is independence. I was 32 years old and proud of my accomplishments as a suburban Denver real estate salesperson. I had saved money for my lovely home and worked hard to establish a prosperous job. This $10 million home represented my hard work and the life I had imagined for myself. And it was more than simply a place to live. A loving marriage had always been my dream. It all seemed to come together when I met Robert, a 35-year-old tech consultant. He was smart, engaging, and seemed to value my aspirations. We celebrated our commitment with delight on our wedding day, but I didn't realize it would also mark the start of a difficult phase in my life. On our wedding day, I was filled with happiness, yet a strange feeling lingered in my mind. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed that Robert seemed distant, his gaze drifting elsewhere. I'd brushed it off as wedding day nerves, believing we were about to start a wonderful new life together. After the ceremony, we moved into my home, eager to begin our married life. For a while, everything felt perfect, but as days turned into weeks, I sensed a shift in Robert's behavior. He became more detached, and his mother, Amelia, started showing up without any notice. Amelia, a 62-year-old retired teacher, often came by offering her opinions on everything in the house, from my cooking to the way I decorated. "Grace, dear, have you considered changing the curtains? They don't match the sofa," she would say with a hint of judgment in her voice. I wanted to defend my choices, to say something back, but I stayed silent, hoping to keep the peace. After all, I was married to her son, and I told myself that maybe this was just how families were. I tried to ignore her remarks, but they began to chip away at my self-confidence. I found myself doubting my decisions, my taste, and even my worth as a wife. One day, I decided to talk to Robert about it. "You know, I love our home, but your mom's comments are getting under my skin. Can we talk about setting some boundaries?" I asked, hoping he'd understand. He sighed, looking away. "She's just trying to help, Grace. Family supports each other. You know how mothers can be." His response stung. I felt disappointment wash over me. Was my happiness in this marriage going to be undermined by his mother's constant interference? I chose to stay quiet, hoping things would improve. Then, one evening, everything changed. After a long day at work, I came home to find Amelia standing in the living room with suitcases stacked around her. "This is my son's house too," she announced, as though I should have expected it. I froze, my heart pounding. "Amelia, what are you doing here?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "I've decided to move in. You can't expect Robert to live without his mother, can you?" Her tone was flat, as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing to do. A sinking feeling took hold of me. "But this is my home. We never discussed this," I said, my voice trembling. "Grace, you need to understand that family is important. You knew that when you married him, she replied, as if it were obvious. I felt my world collapsing. I looked to Robert, hoping he would stand up for me. Robert, please say something. This isn't right. He looked torn, glancing between his mother and me. Mom just wants to help us, Grace. We can make this work. A wave of betrayal hit me, colder than anything I had ever felt. I felt utterly alone in what was supposed to be my safe haven. My home, which felt like my sanctuary, had turned into a war zone, and the one person I had trusted to be on my side, my husband, had chosen his mother over me. This realization hit me like a brick wall. I was battling for my own place in my own life, and it was exhausting. As the weeks dragged on, things only got worse. Amelia's presence became a constant, unshakable shadow, and I felt trapped under her oppressive influence. When I discovered I was pregnant, I hoped this would bring Robert and me closer, that perhaps this news would shift things for the better. But when I shared it, Amelia didn't react with joy or even warmth. She simply raised an eyebrow and said, "You'll need to watch your diet. We don't want any health issues." Her cold, indifferent response crushed any hope I had for support or happiness during what should have been a joyful time. I found myself longing for the days when my life was simple and full of promise, wondering how it had come to this. Then, one late night, after a grueling day at work, I came home only to find the door locked. I knocked softly, expecting Robert to let me in. Instead, I heard Amelia's voice from the other side of the door, her tone cold and final. "You're not coming in unless you agree to sign over the ownership of this house to Robert," she declared. My heart sank. "Amelia, please let me in. This is my home," I pleaded. "Not anymore, dear. This is my son's house. Either you sign it over, or I'll call the police for trespassing," she replied sharply. The harshness of the situation struck me with full force. I had worked so hard to build my independence, only to be locked out of my own home. Tears streamed down my face as I realized I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I was a stranger in the life I had built for myself. I sat on the porch that night, the cold seeping into my bones, feeling utterly betrayed. But in that moment of despair, I knew I had to act. I needed a plan, a way to take back control of my life. I couldn't let them see how much they'd broken me. So I decided to leave for a while and clear my head. I packed a bag and went to stay with my parents, knowing they'd support me unconditionally. The comfort of my parents' home offered some relief. My father, a retired police officer, and my mother, a warm and caring homemaker, welcomed me with open arms. My mom hugged me tightly, saying, "Grace, you can stay here as long as you need. We'll figure this out together." Their support was a balm, but I knew I had to stand up for myself and face this situation head-on. Deep down, a fire was beginning to burn. I was tired of being treated like a victim. I wanted my life back, and I knew I couldn't do it alone. That's when I reached out to Hannah, a close friend from college who had become a successful lawyer. She had always been my confidant, and now I needed her expertise more than ever. After I shared my story with her, Hannah's response was firm and reassuring. "Grace, this is unacceptable. You have every right to fight back. The first step is to file for divorce and reclaim your life," she said. Her words carried a strength I desperately needed. Hearing her say divorce made everything feel real. But what if Robert and Amelia retaliate? She's already proven how ruthless she can be. I confessed, voicing my fears. "Let them try," Hannah replied confidently. "You have the law on your side. The emotional abuse and manipulation they've put you through aren't things to be taken lightly. We'll build a strong case. Over the next few days, we worked together to create a comprehensive plan. Hannah guided me on how to gather evidence of the mental and emotional abuse I had endured. I documented everything: text messages, voicemails, and even the threats I had received. I started keeping a detailed journal, recording every interaction that made me feel small and insignificant. Every time they tried to control or belittle me. One evening, as I was writing in my journal, a specific memory surfaced that had pushed me to the edge. It was a few weeks before I had moved out. I had come home after a long, exhausting day, eager to share my pregnancy news with Robert. Instead, I found Amelia sitting at the kitchen table, going through my personal files. Shocked, I asked, "Amelia, what are you doing?" She looked up, unfazed. "Just checking your finances. After all, you're going to be a mother. It's important to be prepared," she replied, as if her invasion of my privacy was perfectly normal. "Amelia, that's not your place. You have no right to go through my things," I protested, my voice trembling with anger. But she only shrugged, her face cold and unfeeling, and continued rifling through my papers as if I hadn't spoken. That moment was when I truly realized how deep her control ran and how little respect she had for my privacy or my rights as an individual. With Hannah's help, I knew I was building a solid case. I was ready to stand up for myself, no matter how difficult or painful it might be. This was my life, and I was done letting anyone take it away from me. I had protested, feeling a familiar anger rising within me. "This is my business, Amelia. You have no right to meddle in our finances," I said firmly, though my voice was shaking, but she only looked back at me with a cold smile. "Your husband's finances are my concern too, Grace. If he struggles, we all struggle. We wouldn't want that, would we?" Her words hit like a slap, and I felt utterly powerless in that moment. Thinking back on that interaction now, my resolve only strengthened. I wasn't going to let her or Robert dictate my life any longer. I was done being treated as if I were invisible in my own home. As I continued to plan, I realized I was far from alone. Hannah, my friend and lawyer, had become a steady pillar of support, and my parents were my emotional anchors. Their love and encouragement reminded me of my own strength and gave me the courage I needed to fight for myself. One evening, over dinner with my mom and dad, I shared my decision to file for divorce. "I can't just sit back and let them control me anymore," I said with determination in my voice. "I want my home back, and I want to be free of their manipulation." My dad looked at me with pride in his eyes. "Grace, you're making the right choice," he said. "We'll be here for you every step of the way." The next day, with my heart racing, I went to Hannah's office to start the divorce process. As I signed the papers, I felt a mix of fear and empowerment. This was the first step toward reclaiming my life. In the weeks that followed, we worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build a strong case. Every day was an emotional roller coaster as I relived painful memories and prepared my testimony. It felt like I was a soldier gearing up for war. Then the day of the hearing finally arrived. My stomach twisted with anxiety as I sat in the courthouse, surrounded by other people facing their own battles. My palms were sweaty, and my heart pounded in my chest. Hannah sat beside me, holding my hand. "Grace, you're going to do great," she reassured me. "Just remember, you're fighting for yourself and your future." Her words gave me a sense of calm. I took a deep breath, focusing on the outcome I wanted: freedom, peace, and a life where I was in control. I was done being afraid. I was ready to face Robert and Amelia in court. As the judge called my case, a surge of adrenaline ran through me. This was it, the moment I had prepared so hard for. I walked into the courtroom, feeling the weight of my decision pressing down on me. The room was tense, filled with the quiet murmur of people discussing their cases. In the distance, I heard the gavel's sharp strike. My heart raced as I spotted Robert and Amelia seated at the front. Robert's face was expressionless, but his clenched jaw hinted at the tension he was feeling. Amelia's eyes were sharp, her gaze chilling as it landed on me. She gave me a look that sent a shiver down my spine. "Grace, just stay calm," Hannah whispered as we took our seats. "We've prepared for this moment. You're not alone." The judge, a middle-aged woman with an air of authority, entered the room, and everyone stood until she took her seat. As I sat down, I felt my confidence grow. This was my chance to expose the manipulation and emotional abuse I had endured. The judge began by asking for an overview of the case. Hannah rose to her feet, her voice strong and clear as she presented our argument. She spoke about the control Robert and Amelia had tried to exert over my life, detailing the emotional toll it had taken, especially during my pregnancy. She framed the case around my right to live freely and without fear in my own home. "Your Honor," Hannah began, "my client Grace is here today to reclaim her life from the grip of her husband and mother-in-law, who have systematically tried to control her. We have evidence of emotional abuse and coercion, particularly around her pregnancy and ownership of her home, which we believe warrants immediate action." I glanced over at Robert. He remained expressionless, his fingers gripping the edge of the table tightly. Amelia, on the other hand, looked relaxed. She had a slight, smug smile as she leaned in closer to Robert, her gaze never leaving me. As the hearing progressed, we presented the evidence we had gathered: text messages, voicemails, and documented incidents of manipulation and coercion. Hannah highlighted the emotional abuse, emphasizing how it had affected my mental health and well-being, especially during my pregnancy. She painted a clear picture of the cold, hostile environment Amelia had created in my home and how Robert had chosen to support his mother over his wife. Robert's lawyer attempted to downplay the severity of their actions, arguing that Amelia was only concerned for her son's well-being. But our evidence was undeniable. Hannah had prepared every detail meticulously, and it was clear the judge was paying close attention. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I took a deep breath, studying myself. "Your Honor, I loved my husband and welcomed his family into my life, but they took advantage of my trust and turned my home into a place of fear and isolation. I simply want my independence back." As I spoke, I saw Robert glance down, his expression finally shifting, while Amelia's smile faded slightly. The power dynamic had changed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my own story. This was just the beginning, but I knew that whatever lay ahead, I was ready to face it head-on. I felt a strange mix of fear and determination building within me as I listened to Robert's lawyer present his argument. He painted me as an unfit wife, someone supposedly trying to cut Robert off from his family for financial gain. "Grace is exaggerating her claims to take control of their shared assets," he argued smoothly. But I was prepared. When it was my turn to testify, I stood up and took a deep breath, glancing over at Hannah, who gave me an encouraging nod. "I was excited to marry Robert and build a life together," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. But almost immediately, I felt like a stranger in my own home. His mother moved in without my consent and began dictating how I should live my life. I paused, remembering the pain of that night when Amelia had locked me out. I shared the details, the threats, the cold indifference, the helplessness I had felt standing outside my own house. As I spoke, I noticed the judge leaning forward, her expression intent, listening closely to every word. I never imagined I'd be fighting for my own home and my autonomy. I continued, feeling a surge of emotion. This isn't just about property. It's about my identity and my future as a mother. I refuse to raise my child in an environment where I am constantly belittled and controlled. After I finished speaking, a heavy silence filled the courtroom. The judge was scribbling notes, and I caught a glimpse of Robert's expression faltering. I felt a wave of empowerment wash over me, knowing I had spoken my truth. As the hearing wrapped up, the judge turned to Robert and Amelia, her voice firm. You both need to understand the gravity of this situation. The emotional well-being of a mother and her child is of paramount importance. As we left the courtroom, Hannah squeezed my hand. You did incredibly well, Grace. I think we have a strong case. But as I walked out, I caught sight of Robert and Amelia whispering to each other, their expressions tense and angry. My stomach dropped. I knew they wouldn't give up without a fight. The looming threat of retaliation hung heavily in the air. But I was ready. I had faced my fears, and no matter what happened next, I was determined to protect myself and my future child. Little did I know, the real battle was far from over. The next twists in this saga would challenge everything I thought I knew about betrayal and revenge. The days after the court hearing were filled with anxiety and anticipation. I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, balancing between hope and fear. Hannah and I continued to prepare, sensing the tension building on Robert and Amelia's side. Then, about a week later, I got an urgent call from Hannah. Grace, we need to meet. There's something important to discuss. My heart pounded as I rushed to her office, where she greeted me with a serious expression. I just received word that Robert and Amelia are planning to fight back, she said. They're trying to discredit your claims, saying you're emotionally unstable and unfit to be a mother. A wave of anger washed over me. They're lying, I said, clenching my fists. I can't believe they're stooping this low. It's a common tactic, Hannah explained, her tone calm. But it shows their desperation. We can counter this, Grace. We just need to gather more evidence of the emotional abuse you faced. That night, I sat down to write in my journal, pouring out memories that had chipped away at my sense of self. I wrote about every time I felt belittled, undermined, and treated like I didn't matter. With each word, I felt my resolve strengthening. I was no longer the timid woman Robert and Amelia thought they could control. The following week, I received a formal notification for another court appearance. My anxiety returned. But I was determined to face whatever was coming. This time, I wouldn't just defend myself. I would stand tall and fight for my future and my child's well-being. When the day arrived, I entered the courtroom with that same familiar mix of fear and determination. Robert and Amelia were already seated, their faces hard and unyielding. I could feel the tension thick between us, but I was ready. Hannah presented our case again, emphasizing the emotional toll their actions had taken on me and the effect it had on my pregnancy. We had gathered text messages from Amelia, filled with her thinly veiled insults and concerns. I watched as the judge reviewed the evidence, her brow furrowing in concentration. Then it was my turn to speak. I took a steadying breath and addressed the judge. Your Honor, I'm not here to destroy a family. I'm here to reclaim my life and ensure a safe environment for my child. I cannot allow my mother-in-law to dictate my existence any longer. As I spoke, I felt the presence of my parents, who sat quietly in the back of the room. Their support was like a protective shield around me. With their strength behind me, I shared some of the most painful moments I had endured, revealing how trapped and controlled I had felt under Robert and Amelia's influence. Each word was a release, and I could feel the judge taking it all in, her gaze softening as she listened. Robert's lawyer tried to push back, attempting to paint me as irrational and emotionally unstable. But Hannah was relentless in her counterarguments, pointing to the clear documented evidence of Amelia's manipulation and the constant belittling that I had endured. By the end of the hearing, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I had stood up for myself, laid bare the struggles I had faced, and was no longer hiding in silence. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I had finally taken control of my life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace blossoming within me. The road wasn't over, but I was ready to keep fighting for myself and my child. I would rebuild my life, free from the shadows of control and betrayal, no matter how many battles lay ahead. I spoke with raw honesty about how I had been locked out of my own home and how, piece by piece, my very identity had been stripped away. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted as the judge absorbed my words, her expression changing with each detail I shared. When it was Robert's turn to speak, I could see him struggle. He fumbled over his arguments, clearly shaken and less confident. Amelia, however, remained unyielding, attempting to control the narrative. But her manipulation was losing its power with each passing minute. After a long, exhausting session, the judge finally called for a recess. As we stepped out, I felt both drained and hopeful. A couple of hours later, we were called back into the courtroom, and the judge returned to deliver her verdict. Her voice was steady and clear as she addressed us. Based on the evidence presented and the testimonies given, I find that Grace has been subjected to emotional abuse and manipulation. Therefore, I am granting her full custody of her child and sole ownership of the house. Robert and Amelia will face penalties for their actions. The relief that washed over me was overwhelming. A weight I had been carrying for so long lifted off my shoulders, replaced by a sense of freedom and validation. Tears filled my eyes, not just from happiness, but from the bittersweet realization of the family I once believed I had. Hannah hugged me tightly as we left the courtroom. "You did it, Grace," she said, pride in her voice. "You fought for your rights, and you won." I smiled, whispering, "I did it because I knew I deserved better." In the weeks that followed, I moved back into my home, reclaiming my space and my peace. It felt like a fresh start, a chance to rebuild my life on my terms. I painted the walls, redecorated, and began preparing for my baby. Every moment was filled with hope and purpose, a step further from the shadows of the past. I was ready to embrace single motherhood and create a loving, stable home. After giving it some thought, I saw that the betrayal I had experienced had not destroyed me. It had made me stronger. I had learned the value of asserting my rights and taking back my identity. Being a survivor instead of merely a victim made me feel proud of the path that had led me to this point. I made pledges to my unborn kid in hushed tones as I held my expanding belly. We'll create a strong, respectful, and loving life. You'll know that you can defend yourself at any time. I realized then that this was not only a fresh start for me, but also a new legacy for my child, one based on resilience and empowerment. Knowing that I had at last taken back my life, I was prepared to face whatever lay ahead.